Hello and welcome to CrossTalk. I'm Peter Lavelle. The fate of and the battle for Syria. The international community is as divided as the Syrians themselves when it comes to resolving a situation that looks like a civil war with every passing day. Should there be an international intervention to stop the violence, or would doing so make the situation even worse? To crosstalk the future of Syria, I'm joined by James Carafano in Washington. He is the director of the Heritage Foundation's Allison Center for Foreign Policy Studies. In Amsterdam, we have Nick Otens. He is editor of the Atlantic Sentinel and a special correspondent for the Seoul Times. And in Los Angeles, we have James Morris. He's a political analyst, commentator, and editor of AmericaHijacked.com. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want. Jim, I'd like to go to you first. It seems like Western powers have an agenda here. They want to get rid of Assad, but they want to stop the killing as well. Aren't they mutually contradictory?
Well, this is a common problem. We've seen this over and over again around the world. We've seen it in Libya just recently, but you have to remember back we had a similar situation in Liberia. We've had a long-standing problem in the Sudan. So in a sense, it's not a new problem. I'm not really sure if the world is divided. I think generally people agree that the Syrian government has been excessive in its use of force and not constructive. So I do think in a sense there is unanimity in that people think what this government is doing is wrong.
Okay, what do you think about that, James, in Los Angeles here? Because we have kind of a new situation right now. The UN Security Council didn't vote for any kind of intervention or removal of Assad as a precondition to move forward here. So we kind of have a deadlock, obviously. I mean, what's the next move here? Because were we going to get a coalition of the willing that will just go its own way like the West did, led by the United States into Iraq?
Well, Peter, thank you for having me on Crosstalk. What you have here in the Middle East, basically, is an ongoing situation where we're fighting wars for Israel. And you have a divide and conquer agenda that goes back to the Israeli Likudnik, Oded Yonon. He had a paper that he'd written, a strategy for Israel in the 1980s. And that's what these neoconservatives are following. My good friend, Dr. Steven Snagosky, has written about this in a book, his book titled The Transparent Cabal. And what we have are these neoconservatives, which are the vanguard of the pro-Israel lobby in Washington, and they started with Iraq, and they wanted to basically divide and conquer Israel's enemies. They based that Iraq conflict and invasion on the clean break agenda. JINSA, the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, which Colin Powell had mentioned was in control of the Pentagon. If you look at Washington Post editor Karen DeYoung's biographical book about him, you can look up JINSA and Index. People like Richard Pearl, who are associated with JINSA, Douglas Feith, David Wurmser, and they all pushed for this invasion to secure the realm for Israel. And it was based on Likudnik, Oded Yonon's divide and conquer plan, and we see this unfolding in Syria as well.
But can you answer my question? Do you think that now, if we look at not the Libyan precedent, but the Iraq precedent, that the United States and its allies and NATO may try going it alone, having a coalition of the willing and just bypassing the United Nations because there won't be a UN resolution supporting any kind of intervention?
Well, what I think will happen here, Peter, is you're going to have basically Joe Lieberman, who's also part of the pro-Israel lobby, AIPAC, American Israel Public Affairs Committee, and similar, and also Senator John McCain, who's been a neocon hawk as well, basically a mouthpiece for the neoconservatives. I think the next step will be open arming. We've had arming of the rebels covertly coming in from Turkey. Former CIA field officer and a friend of mine, Philip Giraldi, has written about that. I think you're going to basically see a call now for the rebels to be armed in Syria, and they're going to try to engage the Syrian regime. Remember, the end game of this, for the neoconservatives and the rest of the pro-Israel lobby, is to take down that Syrian regime before we go to war with Iran for Israel.
Okay,
that's the bottom line.
Okay, Nick,
and so I don't know necessarily if I don't know if we'll see
I want to go to Nick in Amsterdam here. I mean, I find it very interesting is that I'll agree with Jim in Washington, D.C. I don't think there's any love lost for this regime in Damascus here. But I think there are some countries, important countries in the world, that are worried about what's going to happen afterwards. Just because Assad leaves, let's say, parenthetically, it doesn't mean the violence is going to necessarily stop. It actually could get worse.
Yes, actually, I think everyone worries about what happens next in Syria. Which is why the Russians and the Chinese in particular, they don't want to see the regime gone necessarily. But to answer your previous question, I don't think that the United States and Western powers nor Israel particularly want to intervene in Syria exactly because they fear what comes next. We have a very unclear understanding of what's happening on the ground. In part, that's because the Syrian regime limits international media entrance into Syria. I don't think we know what we're getting ourselves into if we repeat the Libya scenario.
It's very interesting you mentioned that. Jim, if I can go back to you in Washington, it seems to me that we could have the possibility of a partition of Syria, because I think a lot of people seem to forget that 70% of the country is Sunni, and the Alawites in Damascus supporting the current regime. I mean, there's no love lost between them either. Could you potentially see a partition there? That doesn't necessarily mean it's good for anybody in the region or Israel or any other country in that neighbors Syria.
Well, I think those are all very good concerns and questions. I mean, actually, if you go back and look at Iraq in, say, 2005 and 2006, and the problems that you saw come to the surface, what happens when you take away a government which really doesn't provide much governance other than oppressing its own people, when you have deep sectarian divides, when you have all kinds of other divides, when you have endemic corruptions, when you have access from transnational terrorist groups, well, when you take that away, you get Iraq in 2005 and 2006. Syria would essentially be Iraq in a very small place. It would be a very, very difficult and problematic situation, and I think that's why people talk about this, but I don't think anybody has a real appetite to go in there. I must tell you, I think from the U.S. perspective, although the U.S. has interest in how things turn out in Syria, I don't believe you should only use force when it's in your vital national interest, and I don't think that the U.S. has a vital national interest that would justify a U.S. military intervention. There are 4 countries that border this country which are very important: Iran, Iraq, Israel, and Turkey. We have very good relations with 3 of those countries, Turkey, Iraq, and Israel. They have very vested interest in a solution that doesn't make that part of the world worse. I think primarily what U.S. policy should be doing is working with those 3 countries, working on getting them on a common agenda and doing what is best possible for the region and for the people of Syria. But I think this discussion about a direct military intervention by a coalition of the willing is premature and again very, very likely to lead to a really, really difficult situation that make things look like Somalia and other countries and just bad. And I just remind people, the closest we've had to this is Bosnia. And if you remember about the one thing about the European intervention in Bosnia, the Europeans went in basically after the killing stopped. After the worst genocide was over, after the sides had split off, and after everybody was exhausted, then they went in. Going in on the front end is a very difficult and very different scenario.
It's very interesting. James, if I can go to you in Los Angeles, it already appears that the United States and its allies, in one degree or another, and some of these countries are more directly involved, have chosen what's called the opposition there, a mixed group of people here whose agenda is not particularly clear. And they've said that Assad has to go. It's ratcheting things up. You can't turn around and say now, oh, he can stay, okay? I mean, do you think this is one of the fundamental mistakes that have been made in dealing with Syria, because they start from the most important thing they want, and then they work down instead of the other way around? And Jim pointed out in Washington, very good point. This is the Bosnian situation in reverse.
Yeah, but you also have to look at, Peter, what's happening. I mean, obviously we have a genuine situation in Syria. We do have ethnic strife. I mean, you've got the Alawites in control with Bashar al-Assad, and you've got the Sunni with the Muslim Brotherhood, and then you've obviously got Christians and whatnot. And there are sectarian groups there that actually, nobody believes in dictatorship. I certainly don't. And I'd like to see democracy there as well. But there are many sects there, at least several sects there, that are comfortable with the status quo, and they feel very threatened if that regime is overthrown. But let me draw you to a website, thepassionateattachment.com, and there's a post there at the top, and it's titled, "The Israel Lobby's Role in Pushing for Regime Change in Syria." I think it's very important, and you can also go to the website that many of my C-SPAN and similar calls appear at, neoconzionistthreat.com. It's very important to stress who's pushing this. Who's encouraging? And I'm not saying who started it from the beginning, whatnot, or per se, but who's encouraging this. And again, it's the pro-Israel lobby in America through its components such as the NED, the National Endowment for Democracy. You've got a former ADL researcher there, Carl Gershman, who's in control of that. Again, go to that post, the Israel lobby's role in pushing for regime change in Syria. It's at the top of thepassionateattachment.com.
Let's talk about Israel. Nick, do you see that the Israelis have a huge interest in seeing the Assad regime go down? Because I find that a bit dubious. I mean, they preferred to deal with the devils that they know. Okay, they liked working with let me finish the question. They liked working with Mubarak in Egypt because he was the devil that they knew. Go ahead, Nick. What do you think?
Absolutely, and look at the situation in Egypt now. The Israelis are absolutely not very happy about this. They don't know what's going to happen. They don't know if Egypt will honor its peace treaty with Israel. And they're afraid, and for good reason, that if Assad goes in Syria and there is a Sunni-dominated government, that it will be more aggressive toward Israel and will probably continue to support Hamas in the Palestinian territories. So I don't buy this argument that the Israeli lobby in the United States is pushing for regime change in Damascus.
What do you think about that, James?
Well, Nick, you've
All
got
right, James, go ahead. Go ahead, James.
Nick, you've got to look at. Nick, you've got to look into James Bamford's A Pretext for War book then, and what he talks about with the clean break agenda that was co-authorized by three of the leading sponsors of the Iraq intervention: Richard Pearl, Douglas Feith, and David Wurmser. I'm not saying everybody in Israel believes this. I'm talking about the Likudniks that are following this Oded Yanon's strategy. Like I said, it was titled A Strategy for Israel in the 1980s, and that's what these neoconservative warmongers are pushing. Now, I agree with Peter. It's not necessarily a favorable situation if you topple Assad, because you could get the Muslim Brotherhood.
James, I'm going to jump in here. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on the unrest in Syria. Stay with RT. Welcome back to CrossTalk. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're talking about the unrest in Syria. I'd like to go back to Jim in Washington, D.C. With the failed UN Security Council resolution. Jim, what do you think the possibility is now, and very hypothetical again, that we'll see some kind of settlement on the ground instead of outside elements playing a role? I mean, does this give an impetus now? I know the violence is horrific there, but does it give it an impetus to have the parties sit down somehow? The Russians are trying to mediate, and we can see where that will go. If there isn't, hopefully, I don't like to see an international solution with the use of force, but is it telling the Syrians that you have to start drawing lines and you have to start talking, because every conflict is resolved with negotiations eventually?
Well, I will make a prediction, and I do think in this situation what's going to drive events is the internal events within Syria as opposed to the external pressure. Syria is not Libya. Gaddafi was kind of at the end of the world. Nobody really cared about his regime. He was very isolated. Syria is very different. Syria has good ties with Syria. They have good ties with Iran. They have access to the rest of the world. So they're not a completely isolated regime. They can hang on. I mean, they've proven determination to hang on. Last time in an uprising like this, upwards of 10,000 people were killed. I think estimates are about half that now. So the regime may just hang on and crush everything out. The regime may collapse. It may devolve into civil war. But my guess is it's the internal events inside the country that are going to drive the future, and the decision that the regime makes and the opposition makes. And of course, that's very complicated because that's a dynamic relationship, right? Neither one of them is an independent actor. But they're going to determine the future of this country much more than the rest of us that are standing on the sidelines. That's why I really think what the rest of us that are standing on the sidelines, what the United States and other countries should be doing is, we can work to ensure the stability of the region and to deal with this crisis in whatever direction it goes, rather than delude ourselves and that somehow we're going to tell the Syrians what their future is going to look like a week or a month from now.
Nick, it was already mentioned at the beginning of this part of the program is Iran. And my suspicions are it's less about Israel, because I think Israel actually is very worried because it's very confused about what's going on with the Arab Spring in general in the region, because it's not as black and white as it used to be. But Iran is an issue here, and we hear a lot of saber rattling right now. And so let's look at the issue of Syria and Iran, because there's a lot of countries in the world, including the United States, who would love to see the Iranians punished somehow, one way or another. Take down Hezbollah. You mentioned Hamas already. I mean, it really has nothing to do about the poor people of Syria or democracy. It's a geopolitical play to go after Tehran. And Tehran would be a net loser if the regime in Damascus did fall.
Well, it's both, exactly, which is part of the reason why the United States would like to see Assad go, because then Iran loses its only regional ally and it further isolates Iran, allowing the United States and Israel to put more pressure on it to stop its nuclear weapons program, suspected nuclear weapons program. So there is a clear strategic interest.
Go ahead, jump in.
No, I just wanted to jump in on that. I mean, I do think the Iranians are greatly concerned here. I think one of the problems at the top of their concern is if the Syrian regime falls, that in a sense the Arab Spring will blow back into Iran again, and they'll see an uptick in the opposition in their own country. So I think they, not just for the strategic reasons do they want Syria to stay because it's their pipeline, Hamas and Hezbollah, and it's an important regional ally, but I think it also has domestic implications for them that they're really concerned about.
What do you think about that, James? I mean, how does Iran play into all of this here? Because, again, I look at Western mainstream media, and they're just doing this typical colored revolution element here, which we all have to be honest with ourselves. We don't really know much of what's going on the ground because Western media, all media, as far as I can tell, has all but been banned from the country. So all these numbers coming about casualties, guesstimates as far as I'm concerned.
Well, that's a very valid point, Peter. I mean, the end game here is Iran. I mean, the neoconservatives and the rest of the pro-Israel lobby want to take down the Iranian regime because it supports the enemies of Israel and Hezbollah and Lebanon and Hamas. And that's what this is all about. That's what Iraq was all about. Iraq wasn't about oil. How much oil are we getting out of Iraq? It's negligible. I mean, it's nothing. How many, with the American oil companies there? It was about taking down Saddam Hussein because he supported the enemies of Israel and with regard to the Palestinian resistance there. So with Iran, that's what the end game is for this agenda. Like I said, I'm not saying that elements of the pro-Israel lobby started that revolution or uprising in Syria, but I think the numbers have been inflated. I think I saw an RT piece about that, about a reporting entity, and they've been exaggerated in Western media. And like I said, the end game is Iran. You can read my friend's book, The Transparent Cabal, Dr. Steven Stogowski, and that is what we are working towards. They want to take down the neoconservatives and the rest of the pro-Israel lobby want to take down Iran's main Arab ally, and that's Syria. And it all goes back to 1967, Peter, and Israel's deliberate attack on the USS Liberty. I have a good friend, former Republican Congressman Paul Finley, and he told me when Israel got away with murdering American Marines and sailors on the USS Liberty on June 8, 1967, he wrote the excellent book, They Dare to Speak Out, about the pro-Israel lobby influence in America. He said once Israel realized it could get away with murdering American sailors and Marines, and people like John McCain and others and his admiral father covered it up for Lyndon Johnson, they could get away with anything. And that's what we're dealing with here. You've got politicians in America that put the interests of Israel first, and they don't put the best interests of America first. You have neoconservative think tanks like the Heritage Foundation, the American Enterprise Institute. They're all pushing war for Israel against Iran and Syria,
okay, well,
and we're seeing ramifications.
James, let's go to Jim. Jim is from the Heritage Foundation. Go right ahead. Would you like to defend yourself or comment? I mean, are you supporting war?
I mean, you could. Well, I mean, you can go to heritage.org. We have a piece on our website. And we think a U.S. military intervention in Syria is not a good idea. So I think that speaks for itself.
Jim, let me stay with you here.
Yeah, but you also have...
Okay, let me stay with Jim here. Jim, what is the future now, you think, of humanitarian interventions right now? Because Russia and China, particularly Russia, has been very much criticized in Western governments and Western media for its veto, and the Russians are standing by it. Let's listen to what Russia's ambassador to the UN, Vitaly Churkin, had to say about that.
Our effort was directed at ending bloodshed. Those who are accusing us have been trying to fan civil war and conflict in Syria. So, you know, I don't want to mimic them in using this kind of hysterical language, but we should have, they should recall their track record in dealing with the situation of Syria, supporting opposition, sometimes with arms, with their calls for regime change. So the history will show, I think, that Russia has been doing everything we can and continues to do everything we can.
Okay, Jim, so what do you think about that? I mean, what my point is here is that, these humanitarian interventions, which I think is an oxymoron in a way, because so much violence is used. But I mean, it was Libya we're looking at Libya as a precedent where we can do it in other places. And let's be fair, places that the West would like to target. They're called enemies of the West and all that. Friends of the West, they're never going to be targeted that way, even though their human rights records could be deplorable, or et cetera, et cetera. I mean, and I think, the right to protect is a very good case. Russia did that with South Ossetia. We can disagree on that, but that's how Russia looks at a valid form of the right to protect. The South Ossetians were defenseless. They were not fighting anyone. And now we have a people that are in very dire straits, I believe. But the whole idea of a humanitarian intervention has been short-circuited because some Western countries took advantage of the Libyan case.
Well, I do believe that humanitarian operations are really no different than any other kind of foreign policy decision. And in a sense, it's never a simple go to the rule book and it tells you exactly what to do. You have to weigh the merits of all these situations, your own capability, what's the right thing to do, what good can you actually bring to a situation. I actually think the right to protect is a pretty vacuous and empty doctrine that can be used for going after your enemies and can be used actually to prevent people from doing legitimate humanitarian operations. So I would just put it aside. It's going to go to the ash heap of history. We're going to take each one of these cases on their own merit. I mean, I would say in the case of Russia, Russia does have a long-standing relationship with Syria and this regime. I think they have special access, and I do think they have special obligations to make every possible effort to do what they can.
And I think they are.
Keep this from snowballing into. Well,
it looks like the Russians are going the extra mile and trying to get the sides to talk to each other in Moscow, another venue. I mean, the ambassador was very emphatic about all of that. I mean, the reaction from Western politicians and diplomats, I think, was just hyperbole. I mean, the amount of violence that the U.S. has committed against people in the greater Middle East in the last 20 years particularly, it just gets to the point of hypocrisy here. Nick, if I can go to you, what do you think about the future of these humanitarian interventions? I mean, are we at a dead end right now? Or are we just going to see Western powers or a coalition of the willing, as I keep saying, they'll end up doing it because the UN Security Council is not going to back it up anymore?
No, I doubt that we'll see a coalition of the willing, as you put it. The best thing for the United States to do now is support the Arab League, support Turkey, support Saudi Arabia in whatever they can do to help the opposition. But to go back to your point about this responsibility to protect doctrine, I think the situation in Syria now shows that strategic interests always trump humanitarian missions. The Western world may want to help the Syrian people, honestly, but it would be a huge mistake to antagonize China and Russia now by crossing them and intervening in Syria despite their veto. Okay. I don't think that any humanitarian concern in the West will be big enough to actually prompt governments.
Okay, James in LA, I'm going to give you the last word. How do you think this is all going to end? Do you think we will be doing a program on Syria a month from now?
Peter, I think it's going to end with us arming people like John McCain, he's been a neoconservative mouthpiece for years now, putting Israel's interests ahead of America. I think you'll see him and Joe Lieberman and others pressure Obama to arm the rebels in Syria. I think it'll escalate from there. Perhaps you'll see civil war, and you'll see these liberal humanitarian interventions.
We've run out of time. Thank you much for a very, very interesting discussion. It looks like it's going to be a terrible ending no matter how you cut it. Many thanks to my guests today in Washington, Amsterdam, and in Los Angeles. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. Remember, CrossTalk rules. Rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want. Jim, I'd like to go to you first. It seems like Western powers have an agenda here. They want to get rid of Assad, but they want to stop the killing as well. Aren't they mutually contradictory?
Well, this is a common problem. We've seen this over and over again around the world. We've seen it in Libya just recently, but you have to remember back we had a similar situation in Liberia. We've had a long-standing problem in the Sudan. So in a sense, it's not a new problem. I'm not really sure if the world is divided. I think generally people agree that the Syrian government has been excessive in its use of force and not constructive. So I do think, in a sense, there is unanimity in that people think what this government is doing is wrong.
Okay, what do you think about that, James, in Los Angeles here? Because we have kind of a new situation right now. The UN Security Council didn't vote for any kind of intervention or removal of Assad as a precondition to move forward here. So we kind of have a deadlock, obviously. I mean, what's the next move here? Because were we going to get a coalition of the willing that will just go its own way like the U.S. did, led by the United States into Iraq?
Well, Peter, thank you for having me on CrossTalk. What you have here in the Middle East, basically, is an ongoing situation where we're fighting wars for Israel. And you have a divide and conquer agenda that goes back to the Israeli Likudnik, Oded Yanon. He had a paper that he'd written, a strategy for Israel in the 1980s. And that's what these neoconservatives are following. My good friend, Dr. Steven Snagosky, has written about this in a book, his book titled The Transparent Cabal. And what we have are these neoconservatives, which are the vanguard of the pro-Israel lobby in Washington, and they started with Iraq, and they wanted to basically divide and conquer Israel's enemies. They based that Iraq conflict and invasion on the clean break agenda. JINSA, the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, which Colin Powell had mentioned was in control of the Pentagon. If you look at Washington Post editor Karen DeYoung's biographical book about him, you can look up JINSA and Index. People like Richard Pearl, who are associated with JINSA, Douglas Feith, David Wormser, and they all pushed for this invasion to secure the realm for Israel. And it was based on Likudnik, Oded Yanon's divide and conquer plan. We see this unfolding in Syria as well.
But can you answer my question? Do you think that now, if we look at not the Libyan president, but the Iraq president, that the United States and its allies and NATO may try going it alone, having a coalition of the willing and just bypassing the United Nations because there won't be a UN resolution supporting any kind of intervention?
Well, what I think will happen here, Peter, is you're going to have basically Joe Lieberman, who's also part of the pro-Israel lobby, AIPAC, American Israel Public Affairs Committee, and similar, and also Senator John McCain, who's been a neocon hawk as well, basically a mouthpiece for the neoconservatives. I think the next step will be open arming. We've had arming of the rebels covertly coming in from Turkey. Former CIA field officer and a friend of mine, Philip Giraldi, has written about that. I think you're going to basically see a call now for the rebels to be armed in Syria, and they're going to try to engage the Syrian regime. Remember, the end game of this, for the neoconservatives and the rest of the pro-Israel lobby, is to take down that Syrian regime before we go to war with Iran for Israel.
Okay,
that's the bottom line.
Okay, Nick,
and so I don't know necessarily if we. I don't know if we'll see you.
I would like to go to Nick in Amsterdam here. I mean, I find it very interesting is that I'll agree with Jim in Washington, D.C. I don't think there's any love lost for this regime in Damascus. Hello and welcome to CrossTalk. I'm Peter Lavelle. The fate of and the battle for Syria. The international community is as divided as the Syrians themselves when it comes to resolving a situation that looks like a civil war with every passing day. Should there be an international intervention to stop the violence, or would doing so make the situation even worse? To CrossTalk the future of Syria, I'm joined by James Carafano in Washington. He is the director of the Heritage Foundation's Allison Center for Foreign Policy Studies. In Amsterdam, we have Nick Otens. He is editor of the Atlantic Sentinel and a special correspondent for the Seoul Times. And in Los Angeles, we have James Morris. He's a political analyst, commentator, and editor of AmericaHijacked.com. All right, gentlemen, CrossTalk